Hi, Becca.
Hi, Mark.
So we got Halloween coming up.
I'm so excited.
Are you a horror fan?
I am such a horror fan.
So this must be your favorite holiday then?
This is my favorite holiday in the world. I wish October was every month forever.
I think that might be a bit much for some people.
Nah.
In fact, I'm not even sure some people are, a lot of people really aren't into horror. And that can be a little tough one to explain. Why does somebody want to be scared? I mean, why do you think people actually like horror, or some people like horror?
Well, I can't speak for other people, but I can speak for myself. I love horror because it can blend beautiful aesthetics into hideous things and come out with something really interesting aesthetically. Emotionally, I think it lets us explore the darker parts of ourselves, and it also is often really interesting to analyze because it's a social commentary often. Often horror is saying something if you're willing to listen to it.
For example, what do you have?
Well, for example, a lot of the slasher movies from the 80s, the mass killer would go after the teenagers who were engaging in sexual activity. And often the final girl, a phrase in horror used for the girl who survives the massacre, was a pure virginal teenager she would be the one left standing. Or King Kong movies. If you've ever seen all 8 King Kong movies, they reflect the time. So like the King Kong movie from 2005, that they go to the island because they're down on their luck, they're experiencing a recession, and they want to make money. But in the 80s, they go there because they want oil. The island reflects what the people in that society need.
It sounds actually a lot in ways like a fairy tale, because like the original fairy tales, like the Grimm brothers, they were pretty dark. I remember that, like the original Cinderella, her stepsisters would actually cut off part of their feet to go in the shoe, to make them fit in the shoes, but we kind of got away from that. I mean, why do you think we probably got away from some of the horror aspects of fairy tales? Is it all because of Disney, or did we just not respond?
I can't answer that. Fairies were always evil, malicious, vindictive creatures. And then the Victorian era happened in the late 1800s or the late 18th, early 19th century, and they started marketing wallpaper to children's bedrooms, and the wallpaper had these literally cute fairies that were gentle creatures. And so then once they started marketing all that to families, there was this complete shift in the Victorian era time period of fairies being these kind creatures that predated Disney by a long time. So it's all about money when it comes down to it. What's stronger, money or superstition?
That is a whole other conversation that we could have at some point. I like horror too. Sometimes I may be surprised that people don't like horror as much, but they like a thriller, like something a little more. I don't want to say too edgy, but something like the movie The Fatal Attraction.
I love that movie.
We got somebody who's crazy, and you don't know how they're going to act. What's actually probably the difference between like a thriller and a horror movie? Because they seem kind of similar. I always thought a horror movie had to have some kind of supernatural element to it, or something that we're not quite sure exists in our world, whereas a thriller is more based on something we can actually probably read about in the news.
Well, movies can be both thriller and horror, or they could be a thriller, not horror. Horror doesn't have to have supernatural elements in it. Anybody who's ever watched any of the Hostel movies, for those who don't know, Hostel is about these tourists who go to another country and they get trafficked and tortured by the wealthy. And you can have a lot of horror movies that don't have supernatural. I think the difference is the thriller, a thriller is sometimes like Gone Girl. Gone Girl's definitely a thriller, but not a horror movie. And it's a thriller because it has this fascinating plot. So Gone Girl, you want to know who done it, basically. Did Amy Dunn Did Nick done? Who did it? And so
No, that's the one with Ben Affleck where his wife is missing, and they think he's the one who
Nick
did
and Amy
it.
Dunn.
Okay.
Those are the characters. And so I think a thriller is more focused on the plot and keeping you in that world. And a horror doesn't necessarily have to deal with a fast-paced plot.
That kind of works. I mean, what are some examples of probably like stories or movies that you say are thrillers, like this is definitely horror, well, this is definitely thriller? Because I would say the tone counts for a lot. I mean, if you think about The Shining could have been a thriller if you took out the supernatural elements, but it's the way it was shot, it's definitely a horror movie. And would people respond differently if the tone is different, or are they just going to respond the same as they would to that story anyway?
Well, I think a good example actually might be Riverdale. Riverdale, for those who don't know, is the CW. They took old Archie characters.
Oh, I grew up on those. Those were really so fun.
They took Betty, Veronica, Archie, Jughead, and Josie, and they put them in this town. And basically, it's very dark, it's very fashionable, and it's incredibly plot-based. So now, basically, this group of characters, there's all these murders and mysteries and serial killers that every season in Riverdale. And the characters have to, oftentimes, people that are close to them are just getting killed brutally and terribly. And the Betty and Archie and Veronica and everybody solve the murders. And I think that it isn't necessarily a horror. Because even though there's these grim things going on, it's more of a thriller. And maybe a thriller is just sometimes maybe it's more glamorous in the tone. As you said, tone is important.
Yeah, I mean, the Archie books did not have that kind of tone when I was growing up. But that may be aimed at a different crowd. It actually reminds me, you know, a lot of the protagonists or characters in a fair amount of horror movies are teenagers. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of fans are maybe, I don't know if they still are, teenagers. Does that seem true to you, or do you have any idea of why that might be?
Now that I'm thinking about it, I think that most horror movies are teenagers, and it's rare to find them where it's like the adult, and if it's an adult, they're going on some journey, whereas teenagers are just going about their lives and just crazy stuff is happening to them. I think it's teenagers because teenagers, in a way, that's what they're in the media, they're always on trends, they're featured in TV, commercials, everything, and I think it's because they're so close to being adults, but they're just done being children, and they're in this transformative phase. So I think when things happen to them, you as a teenager, it's different than if it happens to you as an adult, because that's going to completely affect what kind of adult you're going to be.
That's pretty interesting. Sometimes I thought it'd be scary as an adult, because when you're an adult, you have a much more set idea of this is the way the world works. And when something comes up to upset that, you can go in denial, or it might cause you more anxiety as an adult, because you're like, things really don't need to be this way. I don't know if that theory is true or if it holds any water, but.
Well, that's interesting, because that makes me think that teenagers, they know that they're close to adulthood, and so they're aware of quote unquote the real world, but they're also just coming out of their childhood which is a time in their lives where they believed in the magic, and all of these things seemed so vivid and real. So now that they're stuck in this phase in between the childhood they just came out of, where everything was real and anything was possible, and they're also self-aware of what adulthood's going to be like, where everything is too real and nothing fantastical is. So really they're torn between these two worlds, and I think when they're put in a horror movie scenario, they're really forced to choose which kind of world are they going to accept.
Now, were there any like scary movies or stories you liked as a kid?
Well, my big brother and I would watch horror movies when I was very young.
Weren't quite 17 yet, right?
I watched Hostel when I was 11, maybe.
Ooh.
But I've always loved and I don't know if this is a horror movie, but my dad and I, starting when I was 7, we loved the Little Shop of Horrors.
Okay, the one with Rick Moranis, the one that came out in the 80s with Steve Martin, or more the original one? Because that was more of a comedy, I think.
The one with the feed me, the plant that goes.
Yeah, that's the one I saw was from the 80s. I think that was the one.
I think it might have been that. I'm not sure. But I mean, I remember what was interesting was that Little Shop of Horrors didn't scare me. But when I was young, I perceived The Princess Bride as a horror movie.
Really?
Because I was when I was 6 or 7, I saw Little Shop of Horrors. And it was my favorite movie. I wanted to watch it all the time. But then when I was also 7, I saw The Princess Bride. And I had nightmares for a week.
What
it was
part?
Because of the scene with the rat.
Oh.
And I just remember that really stuck with me. So the whole Princess Bride movie, but then once I got to the rat scene, I just cried. I was so terrified. But Little Shop of Horrors, which was a horror movie in itself, I was fine with.
And did you read Goosebumps?
I did.
See, I was too old for those.
I loved Goosebumps.
A lot of people did it. A lot of kids did. I mean, does that mean there's a horror market for kids, or is it just that unique series?
No, there's a horror market, because I have kids. A funny story actually is, so the library does the Locked in the Library sleepover in the summer, where there's kids and we have a sleepover in the library overnight. And when we did the first one, when I was reading a book when it was just time to just, relax, wind down. One of the kids was like, "What are you reading? What are you reading?" And I'm like, "Well, I thought I'd read a spooky book and then they're like, "You're reading a spooky book? We want to read a spooky book." And I had about 7 kids who all wanted some kind of spooky book. And when I handed them Goosebumps, they said that wasn't scary enough. They wanted it next level.
Probably not today.
Yeah.
Have you actually been scared by something you read, an actual horror book or story?
Yeah. I read Ring by Koji Suzuki, which was the book that the Japanese movie Ringu was based on.
The remake.
And then the American Ring movie, which is nothing like it. When I was reading Ring, I had to turn the lights on at some parts of it. It is so scary, and it's so different than the movie.
See, the part for me, the movie, I actually saw both the American and Japanese movies, and I thought the American was a little creepier. Is, for those who don't know, it's about a woman who finds a videotape with some really weird images. Then she gets a phone call saying that she's going to die in 7 days. And that videotape with all the weird images, that creeped me out. That's not something I can imagine from a book. With a movie, you get the actors, you get the sound, you get the shading, that can all scare you. It's a lot harder to get that out of a book. You really have to rely on the author's imagination and really how they structure the sentences. One book that creeped me out, I would say, would be The Shining.
I just read that.
Which Stephen King actually gets told is one of his scarier books. And I can't tell the scene that's scaring me because I don't want to spoil it for anybody. But it really does go with some of the twistedness of human nature. I haven't really been scared by too many other Stephen King books. He has said that Pet Sematary scared him, but it was more because of the themes he was exploring as opposed to the actual story itself. That's what I get out of it. Now, you read were you scared at all or unsettled or?
In a way, I think books can be more scary than movies because there's nothing scarier than your own imagination. The author's giving you the names of the characters and on a basic level what they look like, but you're filling that in your brain. So you can make it look scarier than it even is on the page. Whereas in a movie, you have these fixed characters and this fixed CGI, and you know that it's not going to look different than that. But in your imagination, there can be nothing darker or more twisted than the things that the human mind can think of. And so really, I think the author just makes this like blueprint, and your mind fills it in and goes wild. I think that, so this year I've read Salem's Lot by Stephen King, The Shining and It. And I think out of the three, I didn't find Salem's Lot that scary. I found it a good story. But I think I found The Shining and It to be to be scary. I found The Shining to be mildly scary, but I found It to be terrifying in places.
There's a few parts I thought were kind of freaky too.
Yeah.
For that, I actually just read Children of the Corn.
Ooh.
And that's one of the horror movies I did watch as a kid way back. And I remember getting creeped out a little bit by it. And then I watched the movie again last night. And I'm like, this movie's a little slow, but still has some creepy elements. You know, it's just a story about a couple that ends up nowhere in Nebraska, and there's a cult of children who somehow integrate corn into their religion. I had to think about, like, what's creepy about what Stephen King writes, or horror. And I guess for me, a lot of it is kind of what you said, is how well they conjure an image into my head that the author, and when you reread it, the image could change. Whereas with a movie, it's, you know, Freddy Krueger looks like Freddy Krueger.
It's fixed in time and space. Yeah. I think that Stephen King really talks a lot about childhood. He deals a lot with, like, he can really know what messes you up as a child for things, and I think that's really interesting. Another thing that I recently watched that really scared me as a kid, but now is, like, silly, is The Never-Ending Story. Because I used to be so afraid of the dragon in that. And it's not a horror thing, so it's just so interesting, things that you watch now. Like you said, Children of the Corn is really boring, but when you were a kid, it was different. And I think Stephen King taps into that differences in between kids and adults and how things affect their psyche differently.
Well, he definitely has kids in his stories, and as somebody else pointed out, a lot of the kids are psychic in a lot of ways. In the Children of the Corn, there's no really any good kids. In the movie, they added a kind of a psychic girl. There's a psychic boy in The Ring. There's a psychic boy in The Shining. Psychic girl in Carrie, you know, going up to the teens. I mean, can you think of any other psychic children or in Stephen King world? Or
I can't think of right off the top of my head right now. Well, Dr. Sleep, his follow-up to The Shining.
Okay.
But
I think there is another character. There is another psychic child character. Yeah.
And I'm trying to think. I can't think of one right now. But I think that it's interesting that sometimes how horror movies can deal with evil kids and powers. Like The Bad Seed, I just recently read that this year, and it didn't have any powers, but I just think the concept of evil children is pretty interesting in horror.
Why?
I think we're fascinated by how well, as a society, we watch the news and we follow trials and things, and we're fascinated by criminals. I mean, think of just all the procedural shows about criminals on TV.
I try not to.
And I mean, I watch all that stuff, and it's addicting. And then but what we really watch is when there's movies or books about kids. And in fact, that's even true of this year. A book came out called Baby Teeth about a 6-year-old psychopath, and it was wildly popular. It was on the bestseller list for a long time. And I think we're interested in that because we want to know what makes an adult, how does an adult psychopath get to where they are? Like, what happens along the way? And I think that's why we're fascinated with evil kids, because we want to see why are they evil? What happened to them to make them like that?
I thought maybe it could also be because kids are generally are innocent because they haven't gone through that. But if you pervert that innocent and turn it into something a little more evil, then it becomes a little more frightening. There's also the fact, you know, generally It Takes a Village, you know, we love our children. But if you were to love something that turns on you, how do you respond to that? I mean, did you see Brightburn that just came out? I
didn't, but the movie I saw that was kind of like that was Chronicle a few years ago.
Okay.
Which is, there are these, I think it's 3, it might be 2, but I think if I remember correctly, there were 3 high school boys, and they kind of found this crater that crashed to Earth one day, and they all get powers. And I don't want to spoil anything, so I won't say what. event happens, like obviously in the end, but I will say that one of them, after he gets his powers, he starts turning on his friends, and he starts becoming an evil character that he was not before he got his powers.
And then we're getting comments on how power corrupts, and absolutely. Here's one thing. I don't know, how many people we have or that would read horror, but there's always some good circulation in the true crime section. Why would some people may be kind of iffy about horror, but they'll read the true crime stories. And what is it that probably about the true crime that may fascinate them?
I think the true crime is, so horror, as you said before, horror, some people believe it's more supernatural. And so people can, at the end of the day, when supernatural things, people can easily tell themselves it's not real. But true crime is, you also think of it as true horror. It's horror that's real and it's in the world. And I think people, they can't dismiss, oh, this isn't real, it doesn't happen, because it's true crime, it happens all the time. And I think people are fascinated by it because they're scared by it, because it's true crime in a way is the supernatural come to life. It's real evil.
I'm a little fascinated by it.
Yeah, I am as well. I love all that stuff. And I think I love it because we, as a society, follow a set of rules. We're obviously not going to kill or hurt anybody. And I think the people,
in general, yeah,
the people in true crime are people who've decided that they don't want to follow the set of rules by society, and they've kind of gone off the straight and narrow path and forged their own. And obviously it's wrong, but it's rare because people love anomalies, and people featured in true crime are anomalies because they've decided to they're not going to follow the strictures of society. They're not going to follow the rules at the cost of going to jail and being killed, as often happens with people who go the true crime route. But I think people are fascinated with it because, in a way, that could be anybody, including the people reading that book. But it's not, because they're following the rules of society and their own moral codes. But it could be somebody if they snap.
Ouch. Okay. As we're getting up to the end here, do you have any horror books or movies you would recommend to somebody?
I do. I love House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. It's kind of like a cult classic book. It's amazing. If you like experimental fiction, like books that just mess around with the space of the page and that are very interactive, it's a great book. If you like footnotes, this is the book for you. I also recommend Ring by Koji Suzuki. This isn't a very terribly scary book, this next one, but it's weird. I like weird and quirky. I like unsettling reads. So it's called The Ghost Notebooks by Ben Dolnick, and it's really good. It's about this couple that move into this kind of old-timey museum mansion in New England, and strange things start happening, and you don't know what's real and what's not. And I also like, if you like YA, I like the Asylum series by Madeline Rue, which incorporates photographs into the book. It's really cool, like these vintage photographs that the author found of circus freaks and different things like that are directly incorporated into the story.
Okay, I'm more of a movie guy. So, if you haven't seen it, I would definitely see The Mist if you're looking for a movie. It's directed by Frank Darabont. It's a Stephen King novella, but Frank Darabont he created The Walking Dead. He also did The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile. So you're at least going to get a good production value out of this. I would also recommend 1408. That actually started out as a little exercise Stephen King did on his book on writing, and the fans asked him to flesh it out in the story. He did that. They made a movie. It's basically about a guy who purposely wants to stay in a haunted room, then the room starts to mess with him. And as the movie goes on, you learn a lot more about the guy and his past relationships with people, which is difficult to do when you're trapped in a room, but they pull it off.
Nice.
And if you haven't seen it for a while, it's a little more thorough. Go back and watch Seven. with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman.
I love that movie.
It's still really creepy. It's real borderline of horror and thriller. It's just so well acted.
I think my favorite horror movies, is anything directed by Dario Argento. So the original Suspiria, Mother of Tears, Inferno, and Phenomena. He's the master of combining just great, spooky, supernatural plots with this beautiful aesthetics and colors and camera angles and architecture.
Suspiria is pretty colorful. It's got like pink and blues and things like that.
And if you look at all the architecture, the spiral staircase, and just in that scene with the razor wire, it's an interesting movie. Well, I mean, it's a trilogy. You have all three.
Yeah,
movies.
the Witches trilogy. Yeah.
Yes, but he's a master at horror. I think he can create some beautiful horror movies.
Well, if you're looking to get scared, we had a couple of recommendations for you. If you're looking to go in that little comfortable spot, but not quite comfortable spot for commentary, we'll be around the library, so if you have any comments or suggestions,
recommendations,
let us know. Thank you.
Thanks for watching.